Some of the most debated and yet most important stories in the entire Bible are in the first few chapters, right there in Genesis. Are these stories true, myth, something in between? And how do they set the stage for the rest of the Bible? We're going to be talking about that and much more with Dr. Clay Brown from Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church on today's Theology on Air. Well, thanks for joining us for Theology on Air. We are, live on Facebook Live. This will be on YouTube at some point, our podcast feed as well. Go to HoustonTOT.com to learn more about Houston TOT, when our next event's going to be, hopefully soon, our virtual events on Facebook. And just check us out there, HoustonTOT.com, if you haven't already subscribed on, YouTube.
Everything.
Yeah, what's your problem? We don't, get on the ball here. Let's go. God's judgment could come to you. And I'm going to silence my phone. And anyway, so we want to thank you for joining us. That's where to find us, HoustonTOT.com. We are joined today by Dr. Clay Brown, as I mentioned. He is an equipping pastor at MDPC. I'm going to find out what that means in just a minute. His education includes a Ph.D. in Philosophy and Apologetics through Trinity Theological Seminary and University of Liverpool. I think that's where the Beatles are from.
It is.
Sure.
All right. Okay. With a dissertation on C.S. Lewis. And his family also serves as staff for C.S. Lewis, the Merely Christian Cat. Had to mention that.
Absolutely.
So with that, we are going to be talking about Genesis 1 to 11 in this first part of our little powwow today. And in the second part, we're going to be talking about Genesis 12 to 50. So there's something about Genesis 11 that strikes even the casual reader, I think, as somewhat different. I should say as well that I'm joined by Sarah Stone. She is
always the last to be. No, I'm kidding.
I don't think I said my name yet. So.
Oh, that's true.
So
guys, this is Evan.
Okay, Evan. Yeah, pastor at First Lutheran, and Sarah Stone, outreach coordinator for young adults at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church.
Close.
I think. I thought I got it right that time.
Well, it's director, not coordinator, but
Right.
Either way, there's some outreach happening, and young adults are happening.
Folks, she's directing the outreach. She's not just administrating. Okay.
Okay.
It's important. Okay. All that's okay. We still ready? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So Genesis 1 to 11 strikes us as something different. There are 3, 4 main stories, depending on if you kind of how you pair those out. Creation, fall, for example. But major stories that really get to the heartbeat of kind of what is humanity, and really preliminary gospel stuff. There's all kinds of stuff. So, Dr. Brown, may I call you Dr. Brown?
Yeah, you may call me Clay as well.
All right, okay. I'll call you Clay, but you earned that Ph.D. from the Beatles' hometown. So
I did.
Yeah.
That's what, in order to walk across the stage, we had to get our hair cut like the Beatles.
Oh,
It was
yeah.
kind of a interesting. No, we didn't. No, don't believe me.
You didn't just put them up on
When
your
in
head
doubt, Clay is joking.
When in doubt, don't believe me. How's that for your guest?
Did you have to take LSD as well to graduate?
It was optional.
Play the sitar.
It was optional.
So, Genesis 1 to 11. Tell us what we need to know. Everything we need to know. Let's,
Everything you wanted to know about Genesis 1 to 11.
Someone who's really doesn't know much about the Bible. Maybe they tried to read the Bible all the way through once. They picked it up and they got through like Genesis 7. It's like okay, flood. I don't know. Well, that'd have been like Genesis 9. But it starts with 2 creation accounts. Oh, that's controversy right there. Anyway, it starts with, of course, the creation of the heavens and the earth, and Genesis 1 familiar to most people. Then Genesis 2 seems to be a second creation account. So why don't we just start there? Let's talk about creation. What are the main points that would come out of the creation narratives?
Well, I think one of the things we have to consider is that the book of Genesis, the story of Genesis, was not written with 21st century cosmology in mind. There is no way that the ancient Israelites knew anything like we know or cared anything about the stuff that we know about how the world is set up and how the world's going to be run, how the world's created, and how the world's going to be sustained. So I think that's important. I think one of the issues that we have to deal with when we come to Genesis is to try and get into the mindset of the original reader of it, the people who would have encountered this first, and see what the author of Genesis was attempting to communicate to them.
Yeah. How
they would have picked up on images, on references, on information. I think it's a lot different than the things we bring to it. I think a little trapped in some of our contemporary modern mindsets. I could wax eloquent about postmodernity and all those kinds of things here. I'll save that for another time. But the point is, we have a lot of questions about what happens in Genesis that just simply weren't questions for the initial readers of it. And so we have to kind of put those aside. Here's one example. I think with some, and this isn't my idea. You need to know, all of y'all need to know that I'm not the expert on Genesis. I'm a working pastor trying to deal with the text of Genesis in a responsible way. But my reading and research leads me to think that the creation account in Genesis is primarily functional, not material. By that, I mean, we're interested in the material stuff. We want to know how it was done. And that's where we get into the young earth creationism, old earth, theistic evolution, all those kinds of things that were just simply not on the radar screen of the initial readers.
Yeah.
You can make a strong case, I think, for the reality that the ancient world, not just the Israelites, but you look at the Babylonians, you look at the Sumerians, all the other creation epics that were out there floating around at that time, were much more interested in function, purpose. It's a teleological argument and a theological argument, not a scientific one. So I think we have to know that, have to have that in our head, that that's the direction this is going, because this is not going to answer the how the earth was created and the settle our questions about origins and all that kind of stuff. The ancient Israelites cared nothing about the Big Bang Theory, either the scientific theory or the television show, by the way.
Hey.
But, am I cool or what? No, I'm not. But so
We think you're cool.
Yeah. So I think remembering that this is a functional thing, that the verb create in the ancient Hebrew was used more than any other definition, was used to describe how things worked.
Yeah.
The roles that things and people were in. So I think that's what's behind the first creation account. And I'll be happy to say that I think the second creation account in chapter 2 is not simply a replay of day 6, but is a sequel to what a little more of the story of what has happened after day 7, because I think that's just where the text leads us.
Kind of zooming in on the story.
Yeah. So I think that's helpful to get us into that, to know that the particular things that the ancient Israelites were interested in when they thought about things like creation, when they thought about things, were more, why are we here? Why is this here? Why is there anything rather than nothing?
And I think that's a really good word as we do all of this. This is going to be a little sort of mini series that we'll do from time to time in a podcast. Anytime we're looking at scripture, that's kind of a helpful thing to think. It was written for us, but it wasn't written to us. And so we do have to do that every time, is kind of put ourselves as much as possible into the mindset of how ancient Near East listeners might have received this and take it from there. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, and I would also hold that one of the things going on is the answer that God's doing this like that. That's why we have the different days, right? And whether they're 24-hour days or eons is immaterial in a lot of ways. Instead, the focus on who's doing it and why the one who's doing it is doing it. And that's what we're getting out of the first chapter and then into the chapter 2 and so on in the story in Genesis. So if we read it with that understanding in mind, that's probably what the first hearers and readers were getting out of it, that helps us. It calms our anxiety about whether, oh gosh, if you believe in Genesis, then you've got to be one of those fundamentalist, one of those Bible thumpers who just absolutely, just disregards science, pays no attention to science, thinks science is all rubbish, and that's
it's not a science textbook.
Yeah.
I don't thump those either, but in fact, I've never thumped my Bible.
I never quite understood that either.
It's because preachers that get up and do this.
I guess so.
That's not a thump. There's another name for that. It's not thump. Anyway, backslap or something. But
the backslap of the Bible?
Yeah.
That's what it
just
is.
because the Bible
We derailed.
it doesn't go.
His name is Evan. You can
Yeah.
reach him. At,
I would never do that.
So then the creation story, what does it tell us about God and us?
I think it tells us that God creates everything and creates everything with a purpose, and the purpose is His glory. I'm going to get really Presbyterian and Reformed. That's a particular tradition of the Christian community that I'm a part of, and so I can do it, and no one will get too upset.
You're in a safe space.
I'm in a
Clay.
safe space, but the focus is on God's sovereignty.
Yeah.
And God is creating in some ways in chapter 1. And the theologian and Old Testament scholar John Walton makes this case, and if it's somebody wanting to dig into this deeper can just look up John Walton and find some good stuff on what he says. But that he says that God is creating the cosmos as His temple.
Yeah.
And that's chapter 1, and chapter 2 is creating just this space, this world with the people on it as His temple, as a particular manifestation of what that means, a particular realization of what it means for God to be God of the whole universe, and to have created it all from nothing, just simply by the speaking of His words, which is a pretty powerful statement about God's intentionality and God's power and God's purpose.
Yeah. People will say a lot. They'll make a lot out of some what I think are maybe smaller things. For example, in the first chapter, the name of God it's not really a name, but it's Elohim. That's sort of the generic word for God. Whereas the given name of God, I believe in Genesis 2, begins to be used. So the Tetragrammaton, we know it because it's capital Lord. Yahweh is the name given there. I think it's okay to say that. But do you think much about that? I mean, would you say, it must be a separate author? All of a sudden, they're using the proper name of God.
I think going back, this goes back to what I said a moment ago. Our concerns for how many authors we've got going and all that is very much a modernist mindset, and when we give in to that question, then I think we're disregarding the text in what the text is trying to say to us. I think we have to take the text at what some people call face value. That doesn't mean we take it blindly.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we take it uncritically. That we think about what we're doing. We don't check our brains at the door. In fact, one of my operating theological assumptions is this: what has been called, and I call it as well, critical orthodoxy. I'm orthodox in what I believe about Jesus, what I believe about Scripture. I fully believe in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that it really happened, that it wasn't just a good spiritual thing that we can talk about, that the disciples weren't going, oh gosh, I wish He was here with us. And, maybe if we just think hard enough, we can remember Him well, and that'll lead us. No, none of that. I think it really happened, and I have no doubt about that it
Preach.
happened. Yeah, we may go now, and that, and at the same time,
That's what a Bible thumper would say.
yeah, pardon me, allow me to thump. But also at the same time, this notion of critical, and not in the sarcastic, not in the way we're thinking of on today's social media. Not that kind of critical, not trolling. That would be trolling orthodoxy, and I don't have any place for that. But critical in terms of thinking critically, in terms of taking advantage of the resources that we have now, that quite frankly some of our ancient followers of Jesus Christ that we're brothers and sisters with didn't have resources in that way. So we take advantage of that, but we don't take advantage of it blindly.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad you're a C.S. Lewis scholar. Thank you for that. Because of kind of his work of, looking at myth, and I'm not a C.S. Lewis scholar at all. I really haven't even read much of Lewis. But let me ask you this. One of the things that people will say, your average sort of unbeliever, is they'll say, well, why would you believe that creation story? What about the Epic of Gilgamesh? Or I don't know. Any other, that might be a flood narrative, not a creation. But anyway, what about all the other creation accounts, in all these other cultures? Isn't this just one more? And I seem to remember that Lewis said something about, and this is where you're going to be like, no, he never said that. But he said something about like, well, all of these sort of myths were attempts to tell the grand story that people knew were true, maybe because they were made in the image of God, or they had a kind of an innate knowledge of God. So could you talk about that? I mean, just because we have a creation account doesn't mean it's true. And there are all these other ones. Does Lewis kind of talk about that, given his study of mythology and such, that could help us understand that just because there are other stories doesn't make it untrue, or
Well, yes, and I think one of the things Lewis would say about what we're talking about here is that this is representative of the grand miracle. That was his term for it. Mm-hmm. The grand miracle is the incarnation, and he understood that as not simply about the birth of Jesus, but about the very existence of the Word made flesh, life, death, resurrection, the whole shooting match. He would wrap that up in there. And he said that one of the things about the incarnation is that it is myth become fact. That it has some of the benefits of myth. And by myth, I want to make clear, we're not talking about myth as a false story, but myth is an account of things that has certain techniques and characteristics of it in common. Trying to tell a global story. Karl Barth called it saga. You just sort of think of the grand story. And this myth is also fact.
Yeah.
Because it's located in the very real world, not in some sort of historical world, not in some sort of space and time where people like us don't live, but in our space and time. And that Lewis would say, well, that's it's a myth that has some of the same characteristics as some of the ones we've talked about, the Babylonian one, the Egyptian ones, and so on, but it has the benefit of being true. And it's not just a good story, but is grounded in historical reality, so that you can locate the crucifixion of Jesus with the time that Pontius Pilate is in Jerusalem, working for the Romans. There are just all kinds of markers there that differentiate it, in Lewis's eyes, differentiated from myth that doesn't have any of that. That Lewis is trying to connect it with real life, real people, the real world.
I think something else about starting with the creation account, but really a lot of what we see in Genesis, because what we'll be talking about today in this first episode is all the stuff you maybe learned in like Sunday school, like the flood and eating the apple and all that kind of stuff. But that it's, even from the very beginning, is pointing to Jesus, right? Everything in the Old Testament, that's the part of the Bible that comes before Jesus, is little signposts or crumbs or hints toward Jesus. There's a children's storybook Bible that we love that the tagline for it is every story whispers his name. And we see that even in creation, that he's present. We see that in the fall, which we're about to get to. When people say the fall, we just mean where people messed up. And I think that distinguishes it also from other accounts because it's part of this much larger narrative. And I don't know of any other accounts that can say, well, our creation story actually points to, this got us hundreds, thousands of years later doing X, Y, Z. Yeah. Which is kind of cool.
If you're looking for proof, you're not going to find proof. And that's a whole different category of evidence than the kind of evidence we're talking about here, than the historical and social and other means of evidence that Christianity has as at its disposal.
Sure.
So if you're looking for the kind of proof that would satisfy even the most hardened skeptic, if that proof is a repeatable experiment under laboratory conditions, it's just not going to happen.
Let's go back several thousand years at least.
Yes, but that's all right. Most important things in life don't have that kind of evidentiary support to them.
Yeah.
And we manage to think that they're still important and believe in them anyway.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about man and woman,
Yep.
Adam and Eve, and of course they're like you said, they're created on the sixth day, as recorded in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Maybe a few more details. For example, Adam is made out of the dust of the earth, and from his rib is Eve is made, and so on and so forth. Even the words Adam and Eve are Hebrew words, and I'm going back to my seminary days going, what? Nephesh? I'm trying to remember, what are the words of...
No one listening cares what the actual word is. I'm going to put that out there. Maybe I'm wrong.
Sounds good. But anyway, tell us about Adam and Eve, and I don't know if you have any kind of big picture thoughts on the image of God.
Oh, yeah.
What does that mean? What does it mean to be in the image of God?
I'm glad we have just a few moments to talk about the image of God. I have little difficulty in believing that Adam and Eve were real historical people. That doesn't throw me. Because I also think, though, there were symbolic, mythic, saga-like elements to their naming and to their experiences, that they're both real people and archetypes, representatives of something greater and beyond themselves.
Yeah.
And that's not hard to believe. There are a lot of examples of that, in life today. So that doesn't that shouldn't throw any of us to believe that both those things can happen. And I think that Adam and Eve, with Adam's name, meaning human. Yeah, if you're not, if you're a first century, not first century, excuse me, if you're an ancient reader or hearer of this text, and you hear that Adam's name corresponds to a generic name for the race, the human race, you go, okay, I kind of see a little of what's starting to go on here.
Yeah.
So that shouldn't throw us. But I don't think that Adam is also just a symbolic figure. I don't think Eve is just a symbolic figure. Again, I have no difficulty with them, and I don't think that the text requires us. It's if we start getting into the kinds of discussions that we love about that are more naturalistic in orientation, then we've got to start talking about, was Adam a real person, or that because we're trying to get the timing right and the cosmology right and all of that. And I just think those are red herrings leading us in other directions. Adam, they're created, from dust, and I think ancient readers would have seen that as just simply the stuff of mortality. That as bodies decay, what do they turn to? Well, they eventually, you leave them long enough out
Dust.
in bed. That and that the rib. I've read some convincing things from some scholars that say the rib's not. We're not really talking about the methodological approach of, okay, we're going to take a rib out and we're going to put it in with that, but rather that's a better translation is side, like the side of Adam, half of Adam. And if you start thinking of half of Adam is then Eve, then that makes a lot of sense.
That's lovely.
The two become one flesh. Makes sense of that comment. So I think they're created. They're real people, but they represent something else. What do they represent? I think in part they represent God's design for the human race, because they are bearers in some way of his image. We can wax eloquent on that if we want to, what that means. I think at the very least, it means they share some of the characteristics of God in terms of intelligence and love and compassion, and just a number of areas we could go into more detail on. But they share some of those qualities without being God themselves.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
That's
that
very
comes up.
important.
And that's the problem comes up because they end up wanting to be God.
Yep. And we all do.
That's the primordial sin. I want to be like God.
Before you answer your next question, whoever poses it, could you flip that light switch? Because the sun is going down on us, and we'll need a little bit more light.
I'm going to say right when he does it, let there be light.
I was thinking that. Yeah. Okay. But
Thank you,
our
Clay.
camera is so much happier now. Okay, but I don't know if you had a question.
No, I was just going to say that's a great spot to sort of move us ahead to. So we've got Adam and Eve. They've been given instructions by God to tend this garden that they're in, and they have everything they need. And maybe walk us through what happens, sort of the next part of the story, because we're already almost halfway through, and we've just talked about the creation.
Let me just throw out a couple of words real fast, because this is something we're studying in Sunday school right now, and I hope that we can do a whole episode on it later. But I've learned very recently that there are three schools of thought on the image of God, and you can look it up later. But one is structuralist, which is kind of like the character of God, the nature, like personality, some of the attributes you mentioned. Then there's, oh my gosh, I think it's functional. But that's sort of the idea that man is a worker and a producer in the
Creative,
kingdom, creative, that sort of thing. And then the third, which is actually advocated apparently by Luther and Calvin, is relational. So that what makes man have in the image of God is that he can relate to God in a way that, say, a skunk cannot. For example.
Those are excellent points, by the way.
So I would say I don't know why you would need to choose any of those. I don't know why it couldn't be all three. But as what it means to be in the image of God. But yes, so they're given this wonderful Garden of Eden, and they can do everything in there except one thing. And Adam has the job of naming the things in there. So it's kind of arguable. Like Adam's like the first scientist in a certain. He's discovering
taxonomy.
Nature. He's sort of. It's part of perhaps his dominion over nature, that he has power over it. He's naming it. He's saying, you are this thing and you are this thing. And he's sort of coming to understand how the world works and how nature works. And, we don't know the answer to this. But one of the things that seems to happen in Genesis 1-3 is everything happens real fast. But in fact, for all we know, couldn't Adam and Eve have been in the garden for many years or many decades doing this work? I mean, not I don't know, 36 hours or something. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm pretty sure the text is not absolutely clear about the time frame, and so for me to be locked in to a particular, hourly or daily experience that they had is probably not productive on my part, and that just goes to my tendency is to try to go to what the text says and go no further. So I certainly can't think of a reason why that would be problematic.
No,
why that would be difficult. I don't want to. I'm trying to avoid the sort of dogmatism that casts my ideas nearly in Holy Writ.
And I'm trying to sort of expand where some people might. Because again, if you just kind of read it at face value, it's like, chapter 2 ends with Eve's creation, and then you go right into the fall, and it's like, well, yeah, but they could have been in that situation for many, many decades, and we don't know. But anyway, I on the other hand,
I think that's on target. I think that's certainly, at the very least, a plausible possibility. Because
I think people could argue, and I'm pretty sure I've heard this at one point. Well, they couldn't even not sin for one day. You know what I mean? That's something people argue as well.
And that's just us putting our stuff right back on them again.
Yeah.
Because we know we can't go 1 minute.
I was about to say, I can't go one day without sinning. I can't go 1 hour without sinning.
And maybe that was the case, but, anyway, so I'm kind of interrupted, but yeah. No. So they're in the garden. They could have been there a while. It could have been a short time, but we don't really know. But the serpent comes along, and we can talk about whether that was the devil or not. I've had people say, "Oh, that wasn't the devil; it was a serpent." It never actually says it's the devil. Anyway, that may be somewhat irrelevant, but they seem to something goes on in this conversation with the serpent. So,
well, the serpent is the one that provides the temptation, and there's in some way, the temptation is necessary. And I have to admit, I've struggled with parts of this. Why the need to provide the temptation? The best answer I can come up with it is the importance of providing some moral agency.
That's exactly right. Yep.
That a commitment is not a commitment until it's tested at some point.
Yeah.
That a will is not free, and I don't want to get into all the Presbyterian possibilities about free will, but even the most rabid Calvinist will say we have moral agency, that
Yeah.
we have the ability to choose between right and wrong. Well, that's got to be played out in some way
Yeah.
for Adam and Eve in order to be people living in God's way, in God's place, as bearers of God's image. That's just an important component to that, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, we could talk about this for ages. We won't, but just to kind of dumb it down for those in the audience that maybe need that. Maybe it's just me, but the idea that I've heard is that, if you're falling in love with someone, you would never want to maybe like give them a pill or a potion or a spell or something to force them to fall in love with you. You want them to actually fall in love with you. You want them to make that choice based on everything they know about you, to say, yep, you're the one, I'm head over heels. And that's a romance that's different from this, but that God gives us the opportunity to actually love him, not just be automatons that are sort of forced into being his slaves or, minions or something, that we have the ability to say, yeah, I'm in, or screw you. He lets us do that so that we, again, like you said, we have freedom. We have the ability to rebel, and oh, how we do.
Yeah. This is unfortunately, we've talked about Adam and Eve being representatives in some ways. That they're archetypal figures. Well, they're archetypal figures in this too.
Yeah, it's not just the good stuff.
It's not just the love and the care and the nature and the relationship, the relational possibilities. No, we also have managed to receive as part of our shared heritage the capacity for sinfulness, and we can debate the aspects of that, and probably will at some other time. But to know that, that in some way I'm connected to Adam and connected to Eve, because in some way that I can't fully explain, their response to the opportunity put before them has conditioned my response to the opportunities put before me. And so I'm an example of fallen humanity, and we all are around this table.
Speak for yourself, my
listening
goodness.
to this, and that's just where we come from, I think.
So the tree that they were not to eat from in the garden, because they could eat from any tree, but this one was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the serpent says that if you eat of it, you'll be like God. And what does that mean? That's the short question. But is the sin of mankind, maybe to cut to the chase, that we really do want to be like God, that we refuse to live under his sovereign...
Or we want to be God.
We want to be God.
Yeah.
We want to be God, yeah. If we can't be God, then we'll settle for being like God. So anyway, Adam and Eve seem to have some existence with some naivete or just ignorance about good and evil in some way. And was the serpent right in saying that they would become more like God, and God was... So that part wasn't true. The truth was that they wouldn't die. Or the lie that the serpent said was that they wouldn't die. Anyway, we can talk about what kind of death, but we're not even out of Genesis 3 yet. So.
Dude, we've got to pick up this pace. Yeah.
So I guess the question was, what changed with Adam and Eve when they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What knowledge did they get, and did, I don't know.
Well, the knowledge they got was not the knowledge they expected.
Yeah.
I don't think. The knowledge they got was an awareness of their sinfulness, of the whole, they're naked and want to put on clothes, and that in an anthropomorphic way, God is walking around the garden searching for them, trying to find them, and they're hiding from him. They wouldn't have hid from God before. They would have realized they couldn't.
We know that. Yeah.
So I think that the knowledge they got was a knowledge of their own frailty, of their own fallenness, which was a result of their action. So I'm not. It wasn't what was advertised, which I think, by the way, is a quality of sin to this day. That the benefits that come from it are not what's advertised.
That's a good way to say it.
when we're thinking of it. We're thinking, the experience is going to be great. It's going to be pleasurable or whatever it is.
And no one will ever find out.
And no one will ever find
what
it.
stays in Vegas or what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas.
Well, and I think another important distinction of this story is whether we call it Satan, whether we call it the whatever craftiest, animal or whatever, serpent, whatever this thing is, it's bringing in the temptation for evil. And the first thing it does is lie. That's what Satan does. That's what the enemy does. It tells a lie and it takes something true and it perverts it, because God told them not to eat from that particular tree. But the serpent says, did God say you must not eat from any tree? And of course, that's not what God said. But it starts them on this path of, is God not trustworthy? And it's just putting that seed of doubt out there. And then, of course, they take it wholesale.
And usually as was done here in this case, in the guise of half-truth.
Yeah.
There is a kernel of truth to what the serpent is saying, but it's not the whole picture by any stretch. So, which is, trying to come up with application for my life today, what sin promises me is usually not what sin gives me. That what I receive from it is much different, much less than what I think it's going to be when I decide to do it.
Yeah.
Before we leave chapter 3, I'd be remiss if I didn't just mention what many people call the proto-gospel. Was that right? Okay, yeah. 3:15, and I'll just read this verse quickly since we talk about how things point to Christ. This is God now speaking to the serpent, actually. He says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. And so the idea is there then that the child of Eve is seen as an archetype for Mary eventually, and that the son of the woman, the seed of her, would bruise you on the head, which I'm guessing is Hebrew for defeat you on the cross, essentially. But anyway, so if you ever hear that phrase, proto-gospel or proto-evangelion, Genesis 3:15.
Well, it's setting the stage for, as I like to say, Team Jesus and the other team. Setting the stage that there's going to be a seed from the mother of all, and there's going to be a seed, meaning coming down from Satan, evil, the enemy's side, that camp, which I think we see that mirrored when we hear brood of vipers and those kinds of things in the New Testament. That you're on that team. Don't be on that team. Be on the team here of Jesus who saves. And so it's the hint of a rescue, even just like the whispers of it.
Yeah, and it also brings up the idea that the coming of Jesus was not plan B. Because that's what we often think in some
God
of
pivoted.
They got,
look
at what I've done with this creation thing. I wiped them out once and I brought them back and look what they've done. And so I can send my son. And so this has been part of the mix from the very beginning and ends up being part of the story of the scriptures through Old Testament into New Testament. It's this one continuous story that has its beginning in Genesis and not in Matthew.
Yeah.
It works all the way through the Old Testament too. And sometimes we need to be reminded of that because our temptation is to think Old Testament's just bunk. It's just, why should I pay attention to that?
Well, we have to move on. So
yeah.
Adam and Eve have a couple of kids, Cain and Abel. They don't get along very well. Cain kills Abel. There's some jealousy about what is offered to God as a sacrifice. I don't know how much we want to dwell on the story.
I say we move along.
Okay.
Read your Bible and see what you think.
Yeah. Just as a side note, one of the issues of all the stuff we're not talking about today, but evolution, Adam and Eve, federal headship and all that, would be people outside the garden. Could God have created people outside the garden and Adam and Eve inside the garden? And could they have essentially mated to, so that all of us now are common genealogical ancestors of Adam and Eve.
I like how you just throw that in, like, that's this crazy other maybe theory. Think on that while we move ahead.
Exactly, yeah, because the debate would be like, well, even if you affirm like Adam and Eve as historical persons, like, could there have also been people outside the garden? Because that would, one of the questions that comes up, like, well, who did Cain and Abel have? Who were their wives? Was it their sisters and that sort of thing?
It very well may have been.
And who were they afraid of? And the city that I think Cain goes to, the city, where'd these people come from?
Yeah.
So there's got to be some reasonable response to that, I think.
Yeah.
So
Well, let's move to the flood.
That's way easier.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I think I just blew someone's ears out.
And by the way, we always debate the passages, like the conquering passages in Joshua and so on and so forth. Well, Noah has them all beat because everyone died but 8. It wasn't like storming the fort of Jericho, with a couple of trumpets or something. Everyone dies, so we have to deal with God's right to, I think, judge and all of that. So I don't know how you'd want to tackle Noah from the idea again of myth, because a lot of people assume it that way. And again,
well, wait, before we get to Noah, so the idea is Adam and Eve have lots of children. It's not just Cain and Abel.
Right.
And regardless of how we think, that all trickled down and hominids and all these sorts of things, there were lots of people on the earth, and they're multiplying and they're building cities and they're doing a lot of bad things, and rulers are rising up and being bad rulers. We see all of this. The days of Noah, people sometimes use that phrase now, especially if you're watching some sort of like apocalyptic movie. They'll be like, oh, it's the days of Noah, meaning it's getting really bad. And I think in our current culture, we can see that kind of thing happening. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of unrest. So that's what's leading up to the story. I just want to, yeah.
And Adam and Eve lived a long time. So
real long, like 900 something years.
So they could have been having children who maybe could have gone off and formed a city. This is after the fall, so it's not just because they're a family doesn't mean they got along. I don't know about. I'm sure your families all get along, but my family all gets along.
I'm just thinking about the not being an empty nester till I'm 700 years old.
At least they didn't have college and university to have to deal with. So,
oh my gosh.
But you didn't send them off to get brainwashed.
That's what. Well, and that's what Adam's going. I can't believe these student loans cost us.
Oh my gosh, we have lost these guys. By the way, fun fact for Bible trivia: the person in the Bible, and I think all of history, that lived the longest is a guy named Methuselah. So if you ever really want to make like an old person joke, just call someone Methuselah. They might not get it, but you'll chuckle.
Gotcha.
All right, moving us along.
Well, where should we go next?
Let's the flood story. So there's this guy Noah.
It's really, really wicked and all kinds of bad things going on, and God says, I'm really tired of all these people. So anyway, I don't know if you wanted to look at the mythological angle from this or not, or
there's always the question that people have: is this a global flood, or is it some version of a local flood, and or a regional flood? I'm not sure how far out it goes. It's portrayed as, at the very least, and here's the way I've come to understand it, that it could be more of a local or regional flood that covered a great area. Remember, the people writing this have no idea there's North America. They just don't have any kind of that knowledge of geography that we have. But at the same time, I think, regardless of where you land on whether it's a local flood or a global flood, the effects of it are global, and they're portrayed consistently as being global.
And catastrophic.
And hyperbolic. And you see hyperbole all over the account of Noah and the flood.
You think there's hyperbole in the account? That's interesting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of it. I think there are...
Is that a bad thing?
I don't know. When I see things like open up the fountains of the deep and just utter destruction and catastrophe, I think that's what it is saying. But maybe you're referring to something else.
Well, no, I'm really thinking more of the scope of the... And this kind of parallels what happens when we read about Joshua and the Canaanites.
Yeah.
And we get in one passage, they're all destroyed.
And we come back 2 chapters later.
2 chapters later,
yeah.
no, you got to talk with the Canaanites over here. So I think the hyperbole the use of hyperbole is simply a characteristic of ancient Middle Eastern writing to describe something in large terms, global terms.
Bigger than life. Yeah.
Bigger than life for effect, for reasons of emphasis. I'm not saying it's not historic. I'm simply saying their history, their way of doing history, is different from our way of doing history.
Agreed.
So I think the flood happens. I'm not sure it's a global event. Geology seems to have some difficulties with finding evidence for some kind of global flood.
Well, some geology. Again, I'm not trying to be the weird fundy on the panel, but
but there's, I think it's an open question.
For sure.
Least. I'm not trying to lock in on one of it. On one aspect of it. But the part that I think everyone can agree on is the effects of the flood and what the flood is attempting to do, the punishment for humankind because they've betrayed God's ways, that's meant to be seen in a global, all-inclusive context.
Yeah.
Other cultures have flood narratives. Do you think that they're telling this same story? Or because one of the things people say is, oh, every culture has a flood narrative, therefore yours isn't any more true than theirs is. On the other hand, you could say, yeah, every culture has a flood narrative because this flood was the one that they're all talking about.
See, I've never understood that line of argument. Like, well, everyone has one. I'm like, thank you. That you're proving my point. You're not disproving it. Clearly, there was a flood.
Likewise.
So we all agree there was a flood.
Likewise, that doesn't, in my mind, that's not against the biblical version of events. That supports the biblical version of events.
But I think to your average, like to your person who first encounters biblical criticism, that's a very convincing argument. You know, like the idea that it's not unique. Like I think for people to believe something is true, like it has to be the only one of its kind. If someone else says it, then it's like it robs it of its authenticity or something. And I mean,
well, that's true.
So it's kind of that whole thing of like the Sunday school, like growing up in Sunday school and like your mom and dad like tell you this is true, so you believe that it's true, and your Sunday school teachers all said it was true, and then you find out, oh, other people have a similar account. Well, maybe that means the one I was taught isn't true. So it's just that next step of being like, well, not necessarily. You know, you need to, they could be describing the same thing. So.
Well, and I also think a lot of the critics of the biblical narrative, that's why, are really locked into a perspective that I think many people don't recognize. And by that I mean, see, how much gibberish was that? Let me attempt to put that in some kind of
We're well acquainted
frame.
with that kind of.
There's a perspective that says this universe, this world, is a closed system. There is no entry into this world, into any of the events of this world. It's just it's all happening within its little sphere here, and that's called naturalism or materialism, depending on where you're coming from. And the many of the critics of the flood have bought into that system. So one of their operating assumptions is there is no divine origin for this event. There can't be a divine origin for this event. And so when you have that, it's sort of hard to come up with any answer other than, well, that didn't really happen.
Yeah.
I think the presumptions guide the discussion for
Exactly.
them. And so one of the things I would urge Christians to do is to simply recognize the presuppositions that a lot of critics have. It's not to completely say, well, now, I'm not going to listen to them, I'm not going to pay attention to them. It's to listen to them, but to realize that they're coming from a particular set of beliefs that they may not even realize they have. And they're operating from this perspective that colors everything they do.
Yeah.
And so we just simply need to be aware of that.
It's locked in such a way that they have to throw the baby out with the flood water.
Yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Oh, you're here all week.
Okay. Yes. Try the veal. Okay, so we find ourselves where God is saying one of the loveliest verses of the Bible. He says, but God remembered Noah, even in the midst of just so much evil going on. And we didn't have time to talk about it, but there was people being evil, and there was also just some maybe like spiritual, weird, evil stuff happening. Either way, God remembers Noah, and then what happens?
Well, I think God remembers Noah, and God begins the process of restoring life on the planet. That's where we get after 150 days, from when the flood begins, the boat comes to rest on Ararat. And then another 40 days, Noah opens the windows, and the bird flies out, the dove. Well, first a raven, actually, and then the dove goes out. So I guess the raven's going, what? I don't get to go out again? The dove
You failed
goes
the first
out.
time, raven.
You failed that. And thing is, ravens are a lot smarter than doves, but that's what.
It's a little fun fact for you from Clay Brown.
Here, I'm here. I'm a naturalist here all week, and so that's when that starts getting unpacked here. That God has forgiven and is going to continue the process of redemption that's going to be made whole ultimately through Jesus. We have a lot of territory to cover before we get to Jesus, but that's where it's going. So I think that's what's happening here. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Question: they get off of the ark. Animals go out. They do their animal thing. They build an altar immediately, make a sacrifice to God. I love that verse. The kind of innate desire to praise God and offer sacrifice right away. But then Noah very quickly he builds the vineyard, and makes some wine and gets drunk and falls asleep, and he's got the issue with his children seeing him. One of my questions is something like, well, man, after all of that, they took their sin onto the ark. It lived, and they brought it off of the ark.
They brought sin, one of each pair of sin. No, yeah.
Yeah, right. And so one of the meta questions is, well, it's forget plan B, plan C, plan D. It's like Genesis records these events that almost like contradict one another, or it's like God has to start all over. Or they never quite get it right. And I'll just jump to the chase with kind of how I answer that. I say, well, yeah, the Genesis 1-11 is so no one has an excuse. Like any human on earth could look back and go like, okay, you were created in paradise and you messed that up. Okay, he killed everybody but 8 people and you messed that up, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's no one has an excuse. But I'm curious as to if that's something you've ever heard, if people have ever been like, well, geez, they got off the ark and they were sinning all over again. Did they learn nothing?
Well, and my short answer to that is yes. I mean, they didn't learn very much, and I think though that what I see here is a picture of grace. That God continues to work with flawed, fallible people, and we'll see it more when we get into Genesis 12 through 50. How God works with people who are really, in some ways failures. They drop the ball at really critical points, and yet God continues to work with them and work through them. And so I think we're seeing that here with Noah and his family, and the train wreck. That's what happens as Noah gets drunk and all of that. And the scholars have a field day with trying to explain what's happening there. And we probably don't need to go to all the permutations of that.
Drank wine, got drunk, and his kids laughed at him. Anyway,
a lot of scholars have that think that that's code language. They are being used for some sort
Something
of
PG-13 or more.
An indiscretion.
Oh, okay.
Between Ham and Mom.
Oh.
Yeah, it's not pretty.
Oh.
So.
Do you agree with that? Or?
No, not particularly.
Okay.
Because I think Scripture tends to be upfront with stuff. Doesn't have to.
You don't have to read too deeply into
Yeah,
it. Maybe
Well, because later they tell us all kinds of details. So it's like, why would they?
So I think if that was an important component of the story, we would have gotten it.
Well, you said, Evan, something like they get off the boat and they start sinning. And I know you're saying that to make your point, but they were sinning the whole time they were on the boat. I mean,
sure.
I don't think anybody now from Adam and Eve on escapes being sinful and making sinful choices. But that's like the beauty of the whole story, right? 1 through 11 is painting this picture of the whole world and how we interact with God. And of course, when we start the next episode, it'll be really like honing in on one man, one family, but that everybody messes up, but God has a plan to rescue all of us.
And as you know, I know all three of us are involved in kind of hands-on ministry with people who are messed up, which is okay because we're messed up.
Yeah, we're
too.
very equipped to.
And we're and this idea of God continuing and continuing to work with us, to strive with us, to be patient with us, is one that, quite frankly, I find great comfort in. And knowing that it's modeled from the very beginning, God's patience. Well, and some people may say, well, he destroyed the world and with the patience. Well, he could have destroyed the world and all of us with it. You know, that could have been the answer. So God's patience shows even as God is executing fair and just judgment.
And showing his power at the same time.
Showing power.
Yeah.
So I just take comfort in stories like these that, okay, yeah, Noah and his family really drops the ball. Okay, so do I.
Yeah.
And God continues to be faithful to me.
Yeah.
Even as I drop the ball even more.
So we only have a few minutes left in this podcast, but I think there's only one kind of big major event left in the section that we're wanting to tackle. So they come off the boat, they multiply. There's 8 of them, by the way. It's not just Noah and his sons and their wives, and they multiply. And again, people are building cities and scattering, and then
seem to be where bad things happen.
I know, but
Actually.
I love the city.
Great brunch.
Great brunch. Oh my gosh. Okay, so then we get to the next kind of big story, which I joked about how these are the Sunday school stories, but this is not one that's in a Sunday school story because it's kind of obscure, and I think a lot of people don't quite understand it. So, and we only have a couple minutes to unpack it, but it's the Tower of Babel, where, do you want to walk us through what happens there, Clay?
Well, yes, it's simply that they began, as things began reconstituting, one of the things that happens is that there's a gathering here on a plain in the land of Babylon, where they begin to build this great tower that reaches up to the sky, and the stated purpose is to make us famous, to reach all the way up to God, and God then looks at that and says, look, we can't have that. They're all speaking the same language. Let me confuse the issue, change it to where no one can understand each other, and keep this from happening. So the question is, well, why? That sounds like a relatively benign thing that they're doing. And one of the things that I think is helpful to understand here is that what they were building, it's probably what's called a ziggurat, a particular type of building that was noted in the ancient world for having a sacred space and creating a sacred space. And the text tells us that it's to make a name for themselves.
Yeah.
Let us make a name for ourselves rather than to honor God. And so it's of such difficulty, potential problems, that God is compelled to shut it down, because here we have the primordial sin coming up.
I was just going to say it's the exact same sin.
I mean, this is the more things change, the more they stay the same. In fact, there are some scholars who say this is deliberately echoing what's happened in 1 through 3.
Interesting.
That's really all the way from to the tower, from Noah to the tower, is a deliberate echoing of what's going on in 1 through 3.
Interesting. That at the end, they want to be gods.
They want to be God.
Yeah.
Are these stories of God's failure? In other words, God created all this stuff, and they keep messing everything up.
I think the quick answer to that is, have you ever had children? I'm serious.
Yeah.
If you've had children, you know the answer to that is like, you can do all the right things and still love you guys if you're listening.
Well, and there's God and this is, I really want to introduce this in the last 2 minutes of our time, but it's true that God allows a number of things
That's right.
that he doesn't condone. And that's one of the great unanswered questions, quite frankly. We come up with partial answers for that, but why does that happen? And there you get into your different camps of philosophy and theology and so on. There is something that's important about human beings being able to act in some manner of freedom and exercise that freedom in responsible ways. And when that doesn't happen, then God chastises and brings something to happen to bring them back into relationship with him. We just see that over and over and over in the Scripture, not just Old Testament, but New Testament as well.
Well, we have reached the end of Genesis 11, and we said we're going to do 2 podcasts on Genesis, 1 to 11, and then 12 to 50. So we're going to call it a day, not on Facebook Live, if you guys are able to keep going.
I'm going to go ahead and close this out.
Okay. Anyway, so we're going to end the podcast there, but I want to thank you for listening. Find us at HoustonTOT.com. Find Clay and Sarah at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church. I'm at First Lutheran. So you can find us all those places too, all those websites. But HoustonTOT.com is the place to go to keep up with Theology on Tap. So we definitely want you to go there. And until next time on the podcast, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.